Alright, so what we're going to be looking at in this series of training videos is how to actually set up bones and use bones to deform an object and ultimately create a biped and ultimately obviously get that biped to walk and run and animate. But before we go to something as complex as that, what we're going to do is we're actually just going to have a look at what the bones are in Blender. And so using a fresh Blender file, if I just simply add a bone, so Shift A and add armature. And so what you might find over the course of these is we call them bones, we call them rigs, we call them armatures. They all fundamentally are the same thing, but if we're looking for it specifically in Blender, it's referred to as an armature. And so by adding a single bone, we get this object in our 3D view. Oops, sorry about that. And like any object in 3D, we can rotate it, we can scale it, and we can move it around. But, sorry, let's go to front view. But the thing with these bones is, if we want to make them more complex, like anything else, we need to work in edit mode. And so if I tab into edit mode, and what we'll start to see now is that there are three areas that I can select on the bone. I can select one end and grab and move it around. I can select the other end and grab and move it around. Or I can select the middle part here and grab and move the entire bone around. One bone isn't really enough for us to be able to create an animation of any sort. So what we can do is if I select one end of this bone here and I select E to extrude, and what I can do now is I can extrude a bone chain. Now I can extrude bones out like this. Okay. And this becomes quite complex quite quickly. But that's just simply by selecting the head of a bone and extruding it. If I extrude the other direction, and now we can see that those bones are coming out in another direction. Now, we'll talk about parenting and parenting relationships shortly, but what it pays to understand is that the bones will rotate from the fat end. I guess that's important to remember. So if when we're animating this will be a pivot point here where this bone will be able to rotate, if we can imagine it almost like that. Okay. Another thing that we can think about when we're working with bones, if I just undo all of those and bring them all back down to one like that. When we're working with bones, if I select a bone like so and I hit W and subdivide, I can actually change the number of bones like so, and that can make one bone into a complex chain, and we'll use that later on when we're working on our biped character. What we can also do is we can Shift D and I can duplicate bones, Shift D, and what will happen, what we can see now is we've got this dotted line, and this is just letting us know that there is a relationship, a grouped relationship between these bones, that even though they are physically separate, that they can actually, they are parent and child, that there's a parent and child relationship with these bones. And so that's worth noting, and that will become quite apparent later on when we're working on our rigged character. But at this stage, all we're doing is just understanding the basics of how these bones work. If I tab into edit mode, into object mode, sorry, we can see that they work as one object, much the same as if we were to make multiple parts of a mesh within edit mode. We need to remember that if we need to duplicate bones like this to create our rig, we have to do it in edit mode. We cannot do it in object mode, so Shift D. If I've got those two rigs sitting side by side like that, each of those rigs are their own entity, each of them has their own identity, and each of them works to their own set of parameters. So the one on the right hand side works independently to the one on the left. There's no relationship between them. And so we need to remember that whenever we need to duplicate bones or separate them or whatever the case may be, that we need to do that in edit mode. So that's a very basic overview of how bones may work. The idea, I guess, for this is to show you just how they work, so you become familiar with creating bone chains and bone structures. I guess at this stage we're not animating them. The idea is just to sort of see how they work and how you can manipulate them, how you can shift D, how we can start to duplicate them, and so forth. In the next video, we're going to actually create a very simple little bone chain, and we're going to learn how to animate them. So at this stage, what we'd like you to do is just have a play with bones in edit mode, get a feel for how the tools work, get a feel for grabbing, rotating, scaling, get a feel for extruding them and making complex bone chains. And then once we've got that under our belts, we can have a look at how to actually animate these using pose mode. Thank you very much for listening.